The first thing I felt was the biting cold of polished marble sinking into my knees. The second thing I felt was the stinging, explosive crack of a slap across my cheek. The impact was hard enough that my vision whited out at the edges, fracturing into starbursts. I heard a gasp tear through the air, and it took a dizzying second to realize the sound had come from my own throat. But the voice wasn't mine. It was higher, thinner, fracturing on the inhale like someone who had already been weeping for hours. "You ungrateful little thing," a woman's voice hissed from above me, dripping with venom. "The Thorne brats are more important to this house than you will ever be. Don't you dare complain again." I blinked slowly, the blurry world snapping into sharp, terrifying focus. I was staring up at an immense, dripping crystal chandelier I didn't recognize, illuminating a sprawling, gilded foyer I had never seen before. But the true horror set in when I looked down. The hands braced against the marble weren't mine. They were slender, pale, and trembling, and there, stark against the delicate skin of the left wrist, was a faint silver scar, a mating mark I had absolutely never earned. "Oh," I thought. The realization hit me with the eerie, crystalline calm of a man watching his own life end and a stranger's life begin. I've transmigrated. I want to say I panicked. Most people would have. But I didn't. Not really, and certainly not in that first brutal hour. Panic is a luxury reserved for people who don't already know how to survive on their knees. In my old life, I'd spent 26 years clawing my way up from absolute nothing. I had worked 3 grueling jobs to put myself through college, sleeping on subway trains and eating discarded diner food, learning early and hard that absolutely no one was coming to save me. I knew that if I wanted to live with even a shred of dignity, I'd have to build it myself, brick by bloody brick, with my own 2 hands. So, when I woke up inside the body of Julian Hayes, a submissive, delicate Omega newly and unhappily married into the obscenely wealthy Thorne household, some old, stubborn, feral part of my soul simply straightened its spine. Fine, I thought, tasting copper from my split lip. New body, new war, let's see the battlefield. The battlefield, as it turned out, was far worse than I could have anticipated. I found the details the way a soldier finds shrapnel, piece by agonizing piece, each one drawing blood. The original Julian had been sweet, soft, and entirely breakable. He was the kind of Omega who cried when alpha families simply looked at him with disdain. He hadn't married Silas Thorne, the cold, ruthless, and terrifyingly beautiful patriarch of the Thorne Empire, for love. He had been sold into the match by his own bankrupt family to pay off a suffocating debt that neither Silas nor Julian had chosen. And then, the plot of the novel this world was apparently based on began to bleed into my mind. I could feel the memories, faint and sickening, clinging to the back of my consciousness like a nightmare that belonged to someone else. The original Julian had broken under the weight of this gilded cage. He had taken his fear, his grief, and his absolute powerlessness, and poured it like poison onto the only targets he could find, Silas's 3 children. 3 innocent kids who had done nothing but lose their beloved mother, only to gain a step-parent who hated them for being living, breathing proof that Silas had loved someone before him. Leo, Finn, Chloe. Still kneeling on that freezing marble, I closed my eyes, and the memories slammed into me. Flashes of a plot not yet written, but already terrifyingly true in my marrow. A wicked step-parent locking a terrified 6-year-old in a pitch-black closet for talking back. A 7-year-old flinching, shoulders pulling to his ears, every time footsteps echoed down the hall. A 4-year-old girl learning how to hold her breath and hide under beds whenever she heard raised voices. And later, much later in the novel's timeline, this same Omega, pregnant with twins he never wanted anyone to know about, would plot to have those 3 innocent children quietly disappeared from the family line. He would use his unborn babies to seduce a devastated Silas into abandoning the children who needed him most, securing the entire Thorne inheritance for himself. Not on my watch, I thought. Something deep and primal ignited in my chest. It felt suspiciously like an Omega's fierce, biological protective instinct, but it was layered heavily over 26 years of my own hard-won, street-smart stubbornness. The 2 locked into place like the heavy steel bolt of a vault sliding home. I would not become that villain. I would rewrite this tragedy into dust. The maid who had slapped me, Delia, my borrowed memories supplied, a thin-lipped, bitter woman who had decided that cruelty was the only currency she could wield in this house, was still standing over me, Her arms were crossed, her posture smug. She was waiting for the tears. She was waiting for the original Julian to break. I didn't give her a single drop. Instead, I placed my hands flat against the marble and pushed myself to my feet. I moved slowly, testing the balance and weight of this smaller, unfamiliar body. I stood to my full height, squaring my shoulders, and when I finally spoke, my voice came out dangerously steady. It was far steadier than Julian's voice had apparently ever been, if the way Delia's eyes widened in sudden, jarring shock was any indication. "Say that again," I murmured, my tone quiet, soft, and lethally calm. "I want to make sure I remember exactly how you spoke to the master of this house." Delia scoffed, though she took a half-step back. "You're not I am the Omega spouse of Silas Thorne. I am the second parent in this household," I cut in, my voice slicing through the heavy air of the foyer, and even as the words left my mouth, I felt the shape of them settle over my shoulders like armor I hadn't known I was allowed to wear. Whatever this family thought of the boy who used to live in this body, I strongly suggest you find out very quickly who lives in it now. If you ever raise a hand to me again, Delia, you won't leave this estate with a severance package. You'll leave it in handcuffs. Get out of my sight." Her mouth opened, snapping shut a second later like a hooked fish. Pale and visibly shaken by the icy authority radiating from an Omega she thought she had broken, she spun on her heel and hurried down the corridor without another word. I stood alone in that vast, freezing foyer. My heart was hammering wildly against my ribs, adrenaline singing in my veins. I wiped a thumb across my split lip, staring at the faint smear of blood, and thought absurdly, "Step 1, establish dominance. Don't get slapped again. Step 2, find the children." I found them by following the absolute unnatural quiet. That was the first wrong thing, and it broke something fundamental inside me before my hand even touched the nursery doorknob. In a house this obscenely wealthy, a sprawling estate dripping in gold leaf, imported mahogany, and crystal chandeliers, the children's wing was a dead zone. There was no laughter. There was no chaotic arguing over toys. There wasn't even the sound of the television. There was only the suffocating hush of 3 small human beings who had learned, far too young, that being unheard was the only way to stay safe. I stopped outside the heavy oak door. I knocked gently. I waited. When nothing happened, I knocked again, softer this time. "Leo? Finn? Chloe?" I hesitated, my tongue stumbling over how to announce myself. I couldn't say it's Julian, because I could physically feel how that name would make everything inside that room go rigid with terror. "It's me. I'm coming in, okay? I just want to talk." Silence, thick, heavy, and defensive. Then, a small voice filtered through the wood. It was flat, carrying the practiced, deadened neutrality of a hostage. "Are you going to hit us again?" I stood in that opulent, silent hallway and felt something inside my chest violently crack open. It was a chaotic rush of heat, fury, and a profound aching grief. I wasn't grieving for myself. I was grieving for a version of this family that had allowed 3 babies to learn how to ask that question with the casual cadence of asking for the weather report. "No," I said, and to my absolute shock, my voice shook. I hadn't let my voice shake in front of anyone in over a decade. I cleared my throat, pressing my forehead against the wood. "No, I'm not going to hit you, not today. Not ever, I promise you that, and I don't break my promises." Another long, agonizing silence, then the latch clicked. The heavy door cracked open a single inch. One dark, wide brown eye peered out at me from the shadows. Leo. He was 7 years old, but he carried himself like a tiny, battle-hardened soldier standing guard over his siblings' lives. "Promises don't mean anything," the boy whispered. "You already broke lots of them." "Not me," I desperately wanted to say. "Some other version of me you haven't met yet. A ghost I just replaced." But that wasn't an argument a traumatized 7-year-old should ever have to untangle. It wasn't fair to make my redemption his emotional labor. So, instead of pushing the door open, instead of towering over him, I simply sank down. I crossed my legs and sat right there on the hardwood floor of the hallway, uncaring that I was wearing a silk morning robe that probably cost more than my old apartment's annual rent. "You're right," I said softly, looking at him through the crack. "Then let me earn new ones. I won't ask you to trust me yet. I'm not going to ask you for anything at all. I'll just keep showing up until you believe me. That's fair, isn't it?" Leo studied me for a long, piercing, assessing moment. He looked entirely too old for his small face. Behind him, from the depths of the darkened room, I heard 4-year-old Chloe's tiny, trembling voice. Leo, is he going to go away if we don't talk to him? No, I answered, projecting my voice just enough so she could hear me before her brother could answer for me. I'm not going anywhere, Chloe. This is my house now, too. And you three are the most important people in it. I'm staying right here. The door didn't open any further. But it didn't close, either. I'll take it, I thought, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Small victories, brick by brick. I met Silas Thorne for the first time, well, for this Julian's first time, 7 hours later, in the formal dining room. Even before I fully stepped into the room, something deep in my borrowed chest recognized the sheer, gravitational weight of him. It was a biological omega instinct that this body carried, an invisible tether that I hadn't earned but found completely impossible to ignore. Silas didn't look up when I entered. He sat at the head of a mahogany table, large enough to seat 20, bathed in the cool evening light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He was scrolling through a glowing tablet beside his plate, completely ignoring his dinner. He had dark hair that fell impeccably over a face that belonged on the cover of something dangerous and expensive. His jaw was cut sharp enough to slice glass, his shoulders impossibly broad beneath a tailored charcoal suit. When he finally did lift his eyes to acknowledge me, the sheer sub-zero coldness in his gaze hit me so hard I felt it land under my ribs like a physical blow. "You're late," Silas said. His voice was a rich, dark baritone, but the tone was entirely flat. It wasn't a question. It was barely even an observation. It was a fact laid down like a judicial verdict. I pulled out my own chair, taking a seat at his right. I was with the children. That got his attention. His eyes, a startling, stormy gray, like the sky right before a hurricane decides which way it's going to break, narrowed by a fraction of an inch. Something dark and unnamed moved behind them. Suspicion, perhaps. Or maybe it was just the profound, bone-deep exhaustion of an alpha who had long ago stopped expecting anything resembling kindness from the person sitting across his table. "Since when do you go looking for them?" Silas asked, his tone laced with a dangerous edge. "Instead of actively avoiding them?" I met his stormy gaze, keeping my chin perfectly level. I didn't flinch. Flinching was the old Julian's language, and I had absolutely no intention of ever speaking it again. "Since today," I said simply, reaching for a linen napkin and unfolding it across my lap. "People change, Silas. Or hadn't you considered that a possibility?" Something flickered across that carved, ruthless, aristocratic face. It was too fast to properly name, and gone before I could be entirely sure I had seen it at all. But I had seen it, and some small, dangerous, curious part of my soul, some part that had nothing to do with basic survival and everything to do with the way his deep voice had rumbled low in his chest when he said my name, filed the reaction away like a heavily guarded secret. This is going to take a while, I thought, picking up my silver fork and staring across the table at the man who was supposed to end up completely destroyed in a story that hadn't been written for either of us to win. But I've never lost a war I actually decided to fight. Beneath the table, hidden by the heavy linen tablecloth, I rested a hand flat against my stomach. Inside, the twins I hadn't told a single soul about yet seemed to flutter. They were small, unknowing, and entirely, fiercely mine. I made them, and Leo and Finn and Chloe, the exact same silent promise. I am going to protect all 5 of you, whatever it costs me. Silas watched me hold my hand there, his gray eyes narrowing again, tracking the subtle shift in my posture. He said nothing, but he would find out soon enough. Nobody ever warned me that profound, shattering grief could look exactly like cruelty from the outside. I learned that lesson the hard way over the course of the next week. I spent my days meticulously piecing together the broken shape of this family, from the terrified whispers of the servants, from the way Leo's small shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch every time Silas walked past without making eye contact, and from the small, careful, heavily guarded silences Chloe kept between herself and every adult in the house. Silas Thorne's first spouse, the children's mother, had died 18 months ago. In the novel's timeline, it was treated as a passing detail, a convenient plot device. But in this reality, it was a gaping, jagged wound that had never closed. Silas had simply stitched it shut with ice, distance, and work because he didn't know any other way to survive the bleeding. And the original Julian had married right into the rawest center of that wound. But instead of tending to it, he had poured pure salt into it, day after day. until 3 children learned to associate their remaining parents' footsteps with emotional abandonment, and their step-parents' footsteps with physical pain. I understood, somewhere around day 4, that I wasn't just fighting a poorly written plot. I was fighting a grief that had calcified into something resembling emotional abuse, but was really just an alpha who had completely forgotten how to let anyone close enough to hurt him again. And that included me. "You're doing it wrong," Leo told me flatly on the 5th day. We were sitting on the rug in the nursery. I was attempting, rather disastrously, to braid Chloe's dark hair before her afternoon nap. "I am painfully aware," I sighed, wincing as I undid yet another lopsided, tangled attempt. "Feel free to actually help me instead of just narrating my failures, Leo." A heavy pause hung in the room. Then, reluctantly, as if the words physically cost him something, Leo took a step closer. "You cross the left piece over the middle. You're supposed to go under." "Show me," I said gently, dropping my hands to my lap. He hesitated. I watched him freeze, watched the old ingrained fear war violently with something newer. It was a fragile, budding hope that had been growing quietly all week, watered by the simple fact that I kept showing up, again and again, exactly like I had promised. Slowly, Leo knelt down beside me on the plush carpet. He reached out with small, slightly trembling hands, took the strands of his sister's hair, and meticulously showed me the proper weave. Midway through the lesson, Chloe turned her head. She looked up at me with massive, impossibly wide brown eyes. "Are you staying today, too?" "I'm staying every day," I said, my voice soft but ironclad. "I told you that." "Mom used to say that," she whispered, her voice dropping to a heartbreakingly quiet pitch. Something inside my chest cracked so cleanly in half that I actually had to look away toward the window for a second to compose myself before I could answer her. "I'm not trying to replace her, sweetheart," I said, reaching out to gently trace the curve of her cheek. "I couldn't do that even if I tried. She was your mom. But I can be someone who stays. Is that okay?" Chloe thought about it with the profound, terrible seriousness that only very young, very traumatized children can manage. Then, she gave a single, firm nod. She leaned her weight back against my knee, resting her head on my thigh as if she had decided something incredibly important and didn't feel the need to say it out loud. Leo watched the entire exchange without saying a single word, but he didn't pull away from where our shoulders brushed as we worked on the braid. That night, when I was walking back to my separate bedroom suites, I found a folded piece of heavy construction paper slipped neatly under my door. I picked it up and unfolded it. It was a crayon drawing, 4 stick figures holding hands, a tall one with a scowl, Silas, a medium one with dark hair, and 3 smaller ones. But off to the side, carefully drawn in blue crayon, were 2 tiny circles. Next to them, in incredibly careful 7-year-old handwriting, were the words, "The babies." He knew. Of course he knew. Children always know infinitely more than adults give them credit for, and Leo had clearly been listening at doors, holding his breath in the shadows his entire young life, just to survive the adults around him. I slid down the wall of my bedroom, sitting on the cold hardwood floor with the child's drawing clutched in my hands, and I cried. I wept for the first time since I had woken up in this body, in this chaotic, broken world, and I let myself because I was finally realizing that profound grief and desperate hope could live in the exact same breath. I felt like I had earned both. That was how Silas found me. He had come upstairs to inform me, with his usual clipped, icy formality, that we would be attending a high society charity gala the following week, and that he expected me to behave accordingly, but he stopped dead in the open doorway. I was sitting cross-legged on the floor, eyes red and cheeks wet, tracing the little crayon circles with my thumb. The perpetual ice in Silas's expression didn't melt, exactly, but it fractured, just slightly, just enough that I saw something raw and uncertain move underneath the aristocratic mask. "What happened?" Silas demanded. His voice wasn't gentle, but it wasn't entirely cold either. It was tight, with a sudden, confusing anxiety. "Nothing bad happened," I said, wiping my face aggressively with the back of my sleeve, refusing to be embarrassed by emotions that had finally found somewhere safe enough to surface. I held up the paper. Leo drew me a picture. Something fast and violent flickered across Silas's face. Shock, I realized. Genuine, completely unguarded shock, visible for exactly 1 second before he ruthlessly smoothed his features back into a mask of careful neutrality. Leo doesn't draw for people, Silas said softly. He does now. Silas crossed the room. I hadn't invited him in, but he did it anyway, moving with the particular sweeping arrogance of an alpha who had never once in his life had to ask permission to occupy space. He crouched down on the floor right in front of me. He was closer than he had been since I woke up in this life, close enough that his scent washed over me, crisp cedar, expensive musk, and something sharper underneath, like the biting chill of winter air right before a blizzard. He stared at the drawing. His jaw tightened until the muscle jumped beneath his skin. He pointed to the corner. 2 circles. What are those? My heart stopped dead in my chest. I hadn't told him. I hadn't told anyone. Not the private estate doctor who had confirmed it in a hushed, heavily NDA'd appointment 3 days ago. Not the maids. Not even Leo, who I now understood must have simply guessed through the sharp intuition of a child who watched everything. I could lie. The old Julian, the villain of the story I had stolen, would have lied. He would have hidden this pregnancy like a loaded weapon, waiting to unveil it only when it served him best. He would have used these twins as absolute leverage in a vicious war to disinherit 3 innocent children. I looked up at Silas Thorne's carved, unreadable face. I looked into the stormy gray eyes that had gone very still, intensely focused, waiting for my move. And I chose to rewrite the story. They're mine, I said, my voice barely a whisper in the quiet room. Ours. I'm pregnant, Silas. Silas froze. Twins? The silence that followed the word was so absolute, so heavy, that I could hear the frantic drumming of my own pulse in my ears. He didn't move for a long, agonizing moment. He didn't speak. He didn't even seem to breathe. I watched a storm happen behind his eyes that I couldn't fully decipher. It wasn't joy. Not yet. It was something infinitely more complicated, raw and bleeding. It was shock, grief, and a fear so old and deep it had teeth. You're certain? He finally rasped, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. He sounded like a man testing the thickness of ice over a frozen lake before putting his weight on it. I'm certain. And you're telling me? His tone shifted. An edge of razor-sharp suspicion bled into his words, looking for the trap. He was looking for the manipulation, the scheme, the leverage. I understood in that heartbreaking moment exactly what kind of man Silas had been forced to become. He was married to a version of me who would absolutely have used this life inside me as a blade to hold to his throat. The sheer unfairness of it, that I had to constantly prove my own humanity against the ghost of my stolen face, burned hot and bitter in my chest. But I swallowed the anger. Anger wouldn't fix this broken man. Only time and consistency would. I'm telling you because they are your children too, I said, holding his gaze steadily. And you deserve to know the truth about your own family, even if you don't trust the person telling it to you yet. Something in his expression completely shattered. For one unguarded, breathtaking second, Silas Thorne, the ruthless, untouchable enigma of an alpha that this entire city feared and revered in equal measure, looked almost impossibly young. He looked utterly terrified. I don't know how to do this again, Silas whispered, the words tearing out of his throat, so quietly I almost missed them. Julian, I don't know how to let myself want something that could be taken away. I moved slowly, deliberately telegraphing my actions so I wouldn't startle him. I reached out and rested my hand gently over his, right where his fingers had curled into white-knuckled fists against his knee. His skin was burning hot against mine. Then don't do it alone, I said softly, my thumb brushing over his knuckles. Let me stand next to you while you figure it out. I'm not going anywhere. That's all I'm asking. He looked down at our joined hands. He didn't pull away. The warmth of his alpha biology seemed to lean into the contact, craving it despite his mind's protests. You're different, he said finally, looking back up at me. It sounded like an accusation and a desperate confession all at once. Since when? Since I woke up and decided exactly who I wanted to be, I answered, instead of who everyone expected me to become. His eyes met mine, stormy and unguarded, and for the first time there was no ice. For one long, highly charged moment, neither of us moved, neither of us breathed. The space between us felt as thin as tracing paper and twice as dangerous, crackling with an electricity that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Then the soft padding of small feet echoed in the hall. Chloe's tiny voice called out, asking for a glass of water. The tension broke, but not violently. It was gentle, like something precious being set down on a table rather than dropped and shattered. Silas stood up slowly, clearing his throat and straightening the lapels of his suit. The aristocratic ice slid back over his features, but it didn't freeze all the way. It was thinner now, fragile. "The gala next week," he said, pausing in the doorway, his back to me. "Make sure you wear something warm. The East Ballroom is notoriously drafty, and you shouldn't catch a chill. Not in your condition." It wasn't "I care about you." It wasn't even a declaration of affection. But in Silas Thorne's language, it was the closest thing to gentleness he had offered me since I arrived in this universe. I sat there on the floor, cradling Leo's drawing in my lap, looking at the empty doorway. The war was still looming ahead of me, but for the first time, I let myself genuinely hope that I might actually win. The gown they dressed me in for the gala a week later was the color of deep, bruised wine. It was a masterclass in Omega fashion, silk and velvet cut dangerously close to the body, elegant but entirely uncompromising. It clung to the slight curve of my waist and flowed heavily to the floor, wrapping me in an armor of opulence. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my dressing room, studying the stranger looking back at me. I was slender, sharp-jawed, with ink-black hair falling loosely over my forehead in a way I had actually started to like. Not for the first time, I thought, adjusting the silver cuffs at my wrists. I think I could really learn to live in you. Delia, thoroughly subdued and terrifyingly polite ever since our first encounter in the foyer, moved like a ghost behind me. She fastened the final silver clasp at my collar with trembling fingers, strictly avoiding making eye contact in the mirror. Word had apparently spread like wildfire through the staff quarters that the timid, weeping second spouse had suddenly grown razor-sharp teeth. Good, I thought. Let it spread. Let them fear me before they try to cross me. "The children," I said smoothly, checking my reflection one final time. "Are they settled for the night?" "Yes, sir," Delia murmured quickly, stepping back and bowing her head. She hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Master Leo, almost involuntarily, sir, he asked if you might come say good night before you left for the evening." Something impossibly warm and fierce bloomed brightly under my ribs. A week ago, that little boy had stared at me through a cracked door, asking if I was going to beat him. Tonight, he was actively requesting that I come tuck him into bed. "Tell the driver to keep the car running." "I'm going right now," I said, sweeping out of the room. I found all three of them piled onto Leo's massive 4-poster bed, despite it being technically an hour past Chloe's strict bedtime. They had formed a small, cozy conspiracy of blankets, pillows, and one battered, one-eared stuffed rabbit that I now knew belonged to Finn. At 5 years old, Finn was the quietest of the three, but he watched everything with the exact same calculating, assessing gray eyes as his father. "You look like a dark prince," Chloe announced solemnly, sitting up and pointing at my wine-red suit. Coming from a 4-year-old, I took it as the highest possible praise. "I'll gladly take the compliment," I smiled, sitting very carefully on the edge of the mattress so as not to crease the expensive silk. "I heard someone in here wanted a proper good night." Leo shifted, not quite meeting my eyes. I could see the internal war playing out on his small face. He was still wrestling with how much of his fragile heart he was allowed to hand over to someone who used to terrorize him in a timeline he could feel but couldn't articulate. But despite the fear, he scooted closer, his shoulder brushing my arm. That was answer enough for me. "Will you be coming back tonight?" Finn asked softly, clutching his rabbit. It was the first full, direct sentence he had spoken to me all week. "I will," I promised, reaching out to gently adjust the length of the blanket over his legs, "and tomorrow morning, I'll be right here in the dining room when you wake up." "That's not going to change, no matter how fancy the party is tonight." "Promise?" Chloe whispered, holding out a tiny pinky finger. "I promise," I said, hooking my pinky around hers. I leaned forward and pressed a warm kiss to each of their small foreheads in turn. When I got to Leo, I let my lips linger against his hair a second longer than strictly necessary. I understood, somewhere deep in my bones, that trust slowly rebuilt from ashes was worth 10 times more than trust given freely. "Now go to sleep, all three of you," I murmured, standing up. "I have spies in this house. I'll know if you stay up watching cartoons." 3 small, reluctant nods answered me. I walked to the door, leaving it cracked open exactly 2 inches, just the way Leo needed it to feel safe. Then I turned and walked downstairs to face a war I actually knew how to fight. The Thorne Gala was less a charity party, and more a gilded battlefield dressed in imported silk and diamonds. I understood that undeniable fact within 10 minutes of walking through the ornate double doors on Silas's arm. The moment we entered the massive east ballroom, Silas's large, warm hand found the small of my back. It rested there with a heavy, territorial, distinctly alpha weight that made a treacherous pool of warmth uncurl low in my stomach, despite every ounce of cynical good sense I possessed. Every head in the room turned. Alphas, omegas, and betas alike paused mid-conversation to watch us pass, whispering violently behind crystal champagne flutes. I realized with grim, absolute clarity that the original Julian's reputation, spoiled, vicious, cruel, and universally despised by polite society, had preceded me into every single room in this world. "Ignore them," Silas murmured, bending his head so close that his breath stirred the loose hair at my temple, sending a shiver down my spine. "Society vultures. They will believe whatever narrative is most convenient for them until they are violently proven otherwise." "Careful, Silas," I replied, arching a perfect brow up at him, allowing a smirk to play on my lips. "That almost sounded like you were defending my honor." Something warm flickered across his devastatingly handsome face. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was its shy, unpracticed cousin. "Don't get used to it, Julian." I was saved from formulating a witty comeback by the sudden arrival of a man I hadn't formally met yet, but recognized instantly as impending disaster. You recognize men like him the same way you recognize a severe storm front by the sickly yellow color the sky turns right before the tornado touches down. He was tall, golden-haired, where Silas was dark, radiating an easy, synthetic warmth where Silas was pure ice. He possessed the kind of devastatingly charming smile that had probably ruined 100 Omega's lives before mine. His eyes found me first. They swept over my wine-red suit, assessing, intensely interested, and faintly amused, before sliding over to Silas with something decidedly sharper and more toxic buried underneath the charm. "Silas," the man said smoothly, extending a perfectly manicured hand that Silas did not even attempt to take. "I certainly didn't expect to see you gracing polite society tonight. And this?" His golden gaze drifted back to me, the temperature of his eyes warming deliberately. "Must be the infamous second spouse, the one everyone in the city has been whispering about." "Whispering what, exactly?" I asked smoothly, meeting his gaze head-on without a millimeter of flinching. In my old life, I had learned very young that corporate sharks like this fed purely on hesitation and fear. I refused to bleed for him. The man's smile widened, genuinely delighted that I wasn't cowering behind my alpha. "Oh, that you've apparently become quite interesting lately. And I do love interesting things." He bypassed Silas entirely and extended his hand toward me. "Tristan Vance. We're old family friends." Silas and I go back much further than he'd probably like to admit in mixed company. I reached out and shook his hand, mostly because refusing would have caused a public scene that would land us on the front page of the tabloids. But the second our skin touched, I felt Silas go rigid as a board beside me. The ambient temperature of the air between the two alphas plummeted by 10 degrees. I understood instantly that whatever shared history lived between Silas Thorne and Tristan Vance was neither friendly, nor was it finished. "Julian," I said simply, extracting my hand as quickly as politely possible, declining to offer him any further elaboration. "Julian," Tristan repeated, rolling the syllables around in his mouth like he was tasting an expensive vintage wine and deciding he deeply enjoyed the flavor. "I certainly hope you'll save me a dance before the night is through." "He won't," Silas interjected. His voice was a flat, lethal, absolute finality that sliced through the polite chatter. He pulled me half a step behind his shoulder. Tristan's grin only grew sharper, exposing teeth. "Touchy. How fascinating." His eyes flicked back to me, completely unbothered by Silas's murderous aura, his gaze calculated and warm. "The offer stands, Julian, regardless of what your husband attempts to decide for you." With a mocking bow, Tristan melted back into the swirling crowd of silk and diamonds before either of us could respond. I turned to look at Silas. His jaw was locked so violently tight I could see the muscles jumping and ticking beneath his skin. The scent of winter air rolling off him had turned bitter and sharp with pure territorial aggression. "Old family friend," I observed carefully, keeping my voice low, seems to be doing a phenomenal amount of heavy lifting in that sentence. Silas didn't look at me. He was staring at the spot in the crowd where Tristan had vanished. "He was engaged to my late spouse," Silas said. His voice was entirely stripped of all its usual careful aristocratic neutrality. It was raw, bleeding, and ugly in a way I hadn't heard from him yet. He was engaged to her before she chose me instead. Tristan has never quite forgiven either of us for the humiliation. Ah, there it was. The exact shape of the tragic love triangle I had felt looming in the shadows since I first read the bones of this plot in my borrowed memories. Except it wasn't the cliché triangle I had been bracing for. It wasn't a rival for Silas's heart. It was something much stranger, much older. It was an infected wound from a life before either Julian or I had even entered this story, now circling back like a vulture to pick at a marriage neither of us had originally chosen. A marriage that both of us, I was realizing with a slow dawning sense of shock, were actually beginning to desperately want. And now he's circling me, I said slowly, the pieces falling into place like a master chessboard, because he knows it hurts you. Silas's eyes finally snapped back to mine. They were dark, unreadable, and underneath the layers of protective ice, there was something that looked disturbingly like raw panic. Now he's circling you, Silas corrected, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper, because it would hurt me. Whether that is his only motivation is something I do not yet know, but I will not let him use you to get back at a ghost. I held Silas's tortured gaze. I felt something reckless, warm, and utterly feral uncurl low in my chest. Then let's give him absolutely nothing to circle, I murmured. Before Silas could even process the words, before he could ask what I meant, I stepped into his space, grabbed the lapels of his immaculate tuxedo, pulled him down to my level, and kissed him. It wasn't a calculated political move, not really, not the way the venomous plot I had inherited might have written it. This wasn't a poisonous manipulation meant to make a ruthless CEO fall helplessly, obligingly in love with his villainous Omega. It was infinitely simpler, and far, far more dangerous than that. I just wanted to. Silas went utterly, terrifyingly still. For one suspended heartbeat, his body was so rigid I thought I had made a catastrophic miscalculation. Humiliation started climbing hot and acidic up my throat, and I began to pull away. But then Silas groaned, a low, desperate sound, and his massive hand came up to fiercely cradle the back of my neck. He kissed me back like a man who had been quietly, silently drowning for 18 agonizing months, and had just suddenly remembered how to breathe. It wasn't polite. It wasn't gentle. And it certainly wasn't performative for the hundreds of watching elites in the room, or for Tristan Vance's sharpened attention somewhere in the crowd. It was just us. Finally, the ice between us hadn't just cracked, it had completely shattered. His mouth was hot, demanding, and incredibly certain against mine. His other hand fisted so tightly in the silk at my waist that I could feel the heat of his knuckles burning through the fabric, holding onto me like he was terrified I might vanish into thin air if he let go. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing heavily, our chests heaving. Our foreheads remained pressed together. The entire ballroom around us had gone dead, pin-drop quiet. That, Silas said, his voice a rough, breathless rasp against my lips, was not very subtle, Julian. I wasn't trying to be, I breathed back, and for the first time since I had violently woken up on a marble floor as someone else's husband, I felt the treacherous ground beneath this marriage shift into solid rock, something that might actually be strong enough to hold both of our weight. Across the room, standing by a pillar, Tristan Vance watched us. His golden, unbothered smile was still in place, but his eyes, when they locked onto mine over Silas's broad shoulder, had gone razor-sharp and deeply calculating. It was a look that promised, in no uncertain terms, that this game was nowhere near finished. Neither am I thought fiercely, letting Silas pull me securely against his side. Silas laced his fingers tightly through mine, gripping my hand like he had absolutely no intention of ever letting go again. We didn't speak a single word on the long car ride home. It wasn't because the silence was cold. I had learned, over the past few weeks, how to read the subtle differences in Silas Thorne's silences, the way a seasoned sailor learns to read the approaching weather in a sea they've decided to make their home. This silence was full. It was heavy, charged, and crackling with electricity. It was the specific kind of quiet that only settles after something massive and true has been dragged out into the light for the first time. Silas's large hand stayed securely wrapped around mine the entire drive. He didn't let go when the car pulled up to the estate. He didn't let go when the driver opened the door and the freezing night air rushed into the cabin, a stark reminder that 100 watching eyes at the gala would be fueling the tabloid presses by morning. He walked me all the way to the door of my suite. He stood there for a moment too long, his thumb brushing slowly over my knuckles, his stormy gray eyes searching my face for something I couldn't quite name. "Julian," Silas said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet hallway. "That kiss was real," I said, cutting him off before he could talk himself into calling it a strategic maneuver, or spite aimed at Tristan, or anything smaller and cheaper than what it had actually been. I looked him dead in the eye. "For me, Silas, it was completely real. I'm not going to apologize for it." The tight line of his jaw eased, the tension bleeding out of his shoulders. "I wasn't going to ask you to." He didn't kiss my lips again that night, but he lifted our joined hands, the hand he had kept anchored to his the entire ride, and pressed his mouth softly, reverently, to my knuckles. His eyes stayed locked on mine the entire time, and that simple, intensely vulnerable act undid something inside my chest far more thoroughly than the desperate kiss in the ballroom had. "Good night, Julian," he murmured, his voice infinitely rougher than he probably intended. "Good night, Silas." I slipped inside my room, closed the heavy door, and leaned my back against the wood. I pressed a hand flat over my racing heart, feeling it hammer against my ribs. I closed my eyes and experienced the profound, terrifying vertigo of a master strategist watching his meticulous plans get completely, irrevocably rewritten by his own growing feelings. This was supposed to be about survival, I thought wildly. When exactly did it stop being just strategy? Morning brought consequences, the exact same way mornings always do in this world. I walked into the sunlit dining room to find Silas already seated at the head of the table. His glowing tablet, usually glued to his hand, was abandoned. Instead, a freshly printed, folded newspaper lay open in front of him. He didn't say a word when I walked in. He just slowly slid the paper across the mahogany surface toward me. The headline screamed in bold black ink: "Thorne hears scandalous second spouse. Society's most hated Omega stages venue-wide spectacle to save failing marriage." Beneath the sensationalist text was a massive, high-definition photograph of our kiss from the gala, but it was maliciously cropped. The angle deliberately cut out the desperate grip of Silas's hand in my hair, making it look as though I had thrown myself at him, while he stood rigid and unresponsive. It made the entire intensely private moment look incredibly staged and performative. It looked like exactly the kind of cheap, desperate manipulation the old Julian would have orchestrated to cling to his social status. I felt my stomach drop into my shoes. Old instincts from a past life spent constantly being underestimated, misjudged, and dragged through the mud by people who had never once bothered to learn the truth about me, rose hot, defensive, and bitter in my throat. "They're already writing the story they want to sell," I said quietly, gripping the edge of the table so hard my knuckles turned white. "They have been writing that exact same story about you since long before you ever married me," Silas replied, and there was something startlingly, heartbreakingly gentle in the way he said it. "It was an offering of peace. It has never once been accurate. I know that now." I looked up at him, genuinely startled, the breath caught in my throat. "You believe me?" Silas set down his silver coffee cup. He looked at me with an intensity that made the rest of the room fade away. "I watched you kneel on a hardwood floor and promise 3 terrified children that you would never hurt them," he said softly. "I watched you break down and cry over a child's crayon drawing. I have read every single article, every vicious rumor written about you for the past 2 years, Julian, and absolutely none of them describe the fiercely protective, brilliant person I have spent the last few weeks actually living with." His eyes were incredibly steady. They were certain in a way that stripped away every defense I had left. "I know exactly which version of you is real," Silas finished. Before I could even attempt to form a response around the massive lump in my throat, the frantic padding of small footsteps pounded down the hallway. Chloe burst into the dining room. She was clutching a second copy of the newspaper's front page in her tiny fists. Someone on the staff had clearly, and perhaps maliciously, left a copy where the children could find it. My heart lurched with absolute dread. "Is this you and Papa?" Chloe demanded, thrusting the crumpled paper at me. Her massive brown eyes were wide with an emotion I couldn't immediately decipher. "Are you going to be like Mom and Papa?" The massive dining room went dead still. Silas's face went completely, agonizingly blank. It was the specific, terrifying blankness of a man throwing his body over a landmine to protect a wound so old and deep it had never properly healed. I dropped to my knees immediately, bringing myself down to Chloe's eye level, and gently pried the crumpled newspaper from her trembling hands. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" I asked softly, pushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. Mom used to kiss Papa at breakfast," she whispered, her earlier boldness instantly evaporating into something incredibly fragile and small. "Before she got sick. I don't remember it good, but Leo remembers." I looked up. Leo was standing in the doorway, wearing his pajamas. Finn was half hidden behind his older brother's leg. Both of them were watching this scene unfold with the careful, agonizing weariness of children who had learned the hard way that hoping for things was dangerous, that wanting a family too openly only made the inevitable loss of it hurt worse. "I'm not trying to replace your mom, Chloe," I said, repeating the sacred promise I had made to her days ago, because I knew some promises needed to be repeated 100 times before they were fully believed. "But I do care about your papa, very much, and I care about the three of you. That's not something that has to scare you anymore." Leo's dark eyes flicked away from me, searching his father's frozen face for confirmation, for permission, for something to tell him this was real. Silas pushed his chair back. He stood up, walked slowly around the massive table, and to my absolute, genuine shock, the towering, terrifying alpha crouched down on the floor right beside me, bringing himself down to his children's level. The aristocratic mask was gone. In its place was something raw, bleeding, and entirely unguarded. "I've loved your mother very, very much," Silas said. His voice was incredibly steady, but it carried a profound softness I had never heard him use before. "That will never, ever stop being true. She gave me the three of you. But I have been so terrified of losing anyone else that I let myself, and all of us, go completely cold and quiet for a very long time. That was my failure. That was my mistake, not yours. And I am so, so sorry." Chloe's lower lip wobbled dangerously. Finn finally stepped completely out from behind his brother's leg, his eyes wide. And Leo, careful, guarded, hyper-vigilant Leo, crossed the distance in 3 frantic, running steps. He threw his small arms around his father's neck, crashing into him so hard that Silas actually rocked back on his heels. Silas's massive arms came up instantly, automatically, crushing his son to his chest, burying his face in Leo's dark hair. "I'm not going anywhere," Silas choked out, his voice muffled against his son's shoulder, and I sat on the floor and watched a man who had spent 18 months frozen, absolutely solid finally begin to thaw. "Neither of us is going anywhere, I swear it to you." Over Leo's small, shaking shoulder, Silas's eyes found mine. They were gray, unguarded, and full of something that looked dangerously, beautifully close to genuine hope. I felt the twins flutter in my belly, small and safe and entirely oblivious to the war outside, and I thought, this right here is exactly what I transmigrated to protect. Not just the babies from me, but all of us from the tragic story that almost happened instead. But the profound healing warmth of that morning didn't last uncomplicated for long. Peace never lasts when there are still pieces on the board. 3 days later, a thick, cream-colored envelope arrived at the estate, addressed specifically to me. It was heavy cardstock, written in elegant, flowing calligraphy. There was no return address printed on it, but I didn't need one. I instantly recognized the sharp, aggressive slant of the handwriting from the place cards at the charity gala. I broke the wax seal and pulled out the card. "You looked absolutely breathtaking at the gala, Julian. But ballrooms are so terribly limiting, don't you think? Too many eyes, too many ears. I would love the opportunity to properly get to know the fascinating person underneath all that sudden spectacle." "Dinner, just the 2 of us. Friday at 8. I promise you, I am infinitely more interesting than my old friend Silas gives me credit for." TV. I read the heavy card twice. I felt something cold, clinical, and intensely calculating settle over my instincts. It was the part of my brain that had learned, through years of corporate bloodbaths in my past life, to instantly recognize a steel trap dressed up as a polite invitation. This wasn't genuine romantic interest. Tristan Vance didn't want me. He wanted a weapon. He either wanted something from me or he wanted to use me as a crowbar to pry open something buried deep in Silas's past. Either way, I had absolutely no intention of playing a submissive pawn in whatever twisted game he was setting up. But I also understood, with the terrifying clarity of someone who had spent a lifetime reading hostile rooms, that refusing him outright would only make a predator like Tristan more determined. It would make him more dangerous. It would make him circle closer to the children, threatening the fragile, thawing peace Silas and I had only just begun to build. I calmly folded the thick card and tucked it into the inner pocket of my jacket. I was already turning the geometry of a trap over in my mind. If he wants to play games, I thought, a cold smile touching my lips, he is about to learn the hard way that I have never once lost one. That evening, after the children were asleep, I walked into Silas's private study. The room smelled of old paper, leather, and his crisp cedar scent. I walked straight to his mahogany desk and set the cream-colored card down directly on top of his financial reports, offering absolutely no preamble. Silas picked it up. He read it in 2 seconds. His expression didn't visibly change, but I watched his knuckles turn bone-white around the expensive fountain pen in his hand until I thought the metal would snap. "You're not going," Silas said. The words dropped like anvils. It wasn't a request. "I'm not going," I agreed easily, pulling up a leather chair and sitting across from him. "But I'm also not going to ignore it. Whatever it is he's actually circling, Silas. I need you to tell me the absolute truth about it right now. All of it. If we are going to survive whatever landmine he's planting, I refuse to walk onto the battlefield half-blind." Silas looked up at me for a long, heavy moment. Something incredibly old and deeply painful moved behind his eyes, a ghost he had tried very hard to bury. Then, quietly, methodically, he began to talk, and the story he unspooled in the quiet darkness of the study was infinitely darker, stranger, and far more dangerous than a simple, petty grudge over a rejected marriage proposal. "Tristan didn't just lose an engagement when my late wife left him," Silas explained, his voice hollow, staring at a fixed point on the wall just past my shoulder, as if the memory lived in a place he could only bear to look at sideways. "He lost a massive corporate partnership. It was a complete merger between our 2 shipping empires that would have unequivocally made him the wealthiest, most powerful alpha on the eastern seaboard. When she chose me instead, he didn't just lose his pride. He lost the monumental deal that would have single-handedly secured his family's failing company for the next 50 years. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the information, letting him find the shape of the narrative at his own pace. "His family's logistics business has been violently bleeding out for a decade," Silas continued, his jaw tightening. "Terrible investments, horrific leadership, and a complete failure to adapt to modern markets. The only thing that ever kept their creditors at bay was the ironclad promise of that impending merger, and when the engagement collapsed, so did the majority of their remaining credit lines." Silas finally met my eyes, and the sheer intensity in his gaze made my breath hitch. "He is not pursuing you out of heartbreak or lust, Julian. He is chasing what marrying into this family, or destroying this family, would still give him access to: capital, liquid assets. My name forcibly attached to his rotting company's debts to save him from bankruptcy." Something cold and sharp slid down my spine. The puzzle pieces snapped into place perfectly. "He wants to seduce me away from you to get to your money." "He wants to seduce you away from me to humiliate me," Silas corrected, his voice dropping to a low, lethal growl. "And the money is simply the mechanism of my destruction. Tristan has never forgiven either of us for choosing each other over his empire. He has spent 10 years waiting in the shadows for a viable opening to strike." "And he thinks he's finally found one," I said slowly, the realization hardening my voice. "In an Omega spouse that the entire society page already believes is vain, cruel, and completely capable of exactly that kind of monetary betrayal." Silas's eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time since I had met this terrifying man, I saw genuine, unadulterated fear in his eyes. He wasn't afraid for his empire. He was afraid for me. He was terrified of the crosshairs this put me in. "If you are seen anywhere near him, in private, it won't matter what the actual truth is," Silas said urgently, leaning across the desk. "It will be exactly the scandalous story the press and the board of directors already desperately want to believe about you. Tristan will leak it. My trust in you is new, Julian. New things break easily under pressure." I sat back in the leather chair. I turned his words over in my mind, applying the same cold, methodical, ruthless calculation I would have once applied to a hostile corporate takeover in my old life. back when towering glass boardrooms were the only battlefields I knew how to navigate. Then I don't give him a story he can tell, I said, my voice dropping to a dead calm certainty. I give him a trap instead. Silas's dark brows furrowed in confusion. Meaning? Meaning I absolutely accept the dinner invitation, I said. Silas stiffened instantly. A violent protest was already forming on his lips, his alpha instincts screaming at the thought of sending me into a predator's den. But not alone, Silas. I cut him off smoothly, raising a hand. I go with witnesses, with calculated intention, with you sitting exactly 50 feet away, watching every single second of it unfold. If that is what it takes for him to feel steady and confident in his victory, let him think he's got an opening. Let him get arrogant and show his hand. A narcissistic man like Tristan won't be able to resist bragging about his master plan if he truly believes he has already won. And if he tries something? Silas demanded, his voice dangerously low, the cedar scent in the room spiking with aggression. If he lays a hand on you, then you will have your undeniable legal grounds to end whatever leverage he thinks he holds over this family, I said calmly. Publicly, permanently, but we won't know the exact mechanics of his threat until we let him think he is successfully executing the first step of it. Silas was completely quiet for a long, agonizing minute. His jaw worked furiously. I could see the old, violent, protective instinct warring visibly against the cold, undeniable logic of the strategy I was proposing. Finally, Silas exhaled a ragged breath. Some of the rigid tension bled out of his massive shoulders in a gesture of reluctant, terrified surrender. I hate this plan, Silas said, rubbing his temples. I don't like it at all. You don't have to like it, I said gently, offering him a soft smile. You just have to trust me to execute it. Something profound shifted in his expression. It was soft, unguarded, and almost startled, as if the word trust had landed somewhere deep inside him that he hadn't expected it to reach so soon. I do trust you, Silas said quietly, looking at me like I was the only thing in the room. And that is exactly what terrifies me the most about all of this. The dinner with Tristan Vance took place 5 days later at an exclusive, ridiculously expensive French restaurant of his choosing. The aesthetic was entirely low, moody lighting, velvet booths, and expensive discretion. It was exactly the kind of place built specifically for illicit affairs and corporate treason. I purposely wore a simple, sharp black suit, no silk, no deep wine red, no opulent jewelry. It was the exact opposite of the spectacle of the gala, because I wanted him vastly underestimating exactly how deliberate, cold, and calculated I was being. You came, Tristan said, rising smoothly from his velvet booth as the maitre d' led me over. His warm, synthetic smile was firmly in place, the low candlelight catching the gold in his hair. I must confess, Julian, I didn't actually expect you to show up. I'm full of surprises, I replied smoothly. I took my seat, making absolutely certain to angle my chair so I had a clear, unobstructed line of sight to the discreet, shadowy corner table across the room. There Silas sat, nursing a glass of scotch, and aggressively ignoring a folder of paperwork he pretended to read. He was close enough to cross the room in 5 seconds if I signaled, but far enough into the shadows to let this play out without Tristan noticing him immediately. Tristan's sharp eyes tracked the subtle movement of my gaze. He caught the silhouette in the corner, and he understood immediately. His smile sharpened. He didn't look deterred. He looked utterly delighted by the challenge. Bringing a chaperone? Tristan mused, swirling the wine in his glass. How very domestic. How very married of you. I prefer to think of it as bringing a witness, I said pleasantly, spreading my napkin over my lap. Just in case this conversation happens to turn into something worth remembering accurately in a deposition. Careful, Julian, Tristan laughed softly, leaning back against the velvet cushions, looking highly amused. You almost sound like you don't trust my intentions. I don't, I said, my voice completely devoid of heat or emotion. That's not an insult, Tristan. It's just a simple operational fact. But I am extremely curious about what you actually want, because I am not an idiot, and I know for a fact that it isn't me. Tristan's perfect smile flickered. It was just a millimeter, just a fraction of a second, but it was enough for me to catch it before he smoothed it back into his practiced, aristocratic charm. You wound me, he deflected smoothly. I doubt that very much. You are a remarkably beautiful Omega. I folded my hands together on the crisp white tablecloth, dropping the polite pretense completely, and met his eyes with the cold, dead stare of a corporate executioner. I know about the failed shipping merger, Tristan, I said softly, watching the color begin to drain from his face. I know exactly what that engagement falling apart cost your family's empire. I know your credit lines are bleeding out. And I know exactly what kind of desperate opening you think you've found in a high-profile marriage that society already assumes is built on nothing but shallow greed. I let the heavy, loaded silence settle over the table. I watched something behind his golden eyes snap. The charming facade dropped away by rapid degrees, replaced by the cornered, dangerous look of a desperate CEO. So, I continued smoothly, let's skip the pathetic attempt at seduction and get straight to the actual extortion. What is it you are proposing? For a long, tense moment, Tristan simply studied me. There was a grudging, calculating respect flickering through his expression now, warring with his absolute arrogance. You are significantly sharper than the private investigator's report suggested, Tristan muttered. The reports were wrong about a lot of things, I replied easily. Tristan exhaled a sharp, humorless laugh. Fine, no games then. He leaned forward, bracing his elbows on the table, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, lethal whisper. Leave him. Don't make it dramatic. Do it quietly, cleanly, and publicly cite irreconcilable differences. A mutual, civil separation. In exchange, my backers will ensure you are compensated generously enough in offshore accounts that you will never need to rely on the Thorne name or their lawyers ever again. And what do you get out of this divorce? I asked, feigning mild curiosity. I get access to forcefully renegotiate 3 major international shipping contracts that Silas has been vindictively sitting on out of pure spite for a decade, Tristan said, his eyes gleaming with greed. With his public image fractured by a sudden scandalous divorce, his board will force him to open the bids to stabilize the stock. That's all. No messy scandal, no public spectacle for the kids. Just a clean business transaction, dressed up as a broken heart for the cameras. And if I refuse your generous offer? I asked, my tone dropping to freezing. Something infinitely colder and nastier slid across Tristan's handsome face. Then the scandalous story writes itself without your cooperation, Julian. An Omega spouse with your infamous reputation for cruelty and greed, dining privately, intimately, in a dark restaurant with an old, handsome family friend. My photographers are already outside. The tabloids will gladly fill in whatever blanks I leave for them. Silas's trust in you is a new, fragile thing. When the papers hit tomorrow morning with photos of us, that trust will shatter, and you will be thrown out onto the street with absolutely nothing. There it was, the knife finally laid bare on the table. It wasn't a romantic pursuit at all. It was corporate blackmail, wrapped in a golden smile, and a threat of utter social annihilation. I felt something deep inside my chest go incredibly calm and terrifyingly still. It was the specific, absolute peace that only comes in the exact second right before you spring a steel trap you've spent a week meticulously building. That is a very interesting offer, Tristan, I said evenly, especially considering I just recorded every single word of it. I reached into my suit jacket, pulled out my sleek smartphone, and set it face up on the tablecloth. The screen was brightly lit, the high-definition voice recording app clearly visible, the red timer ticking steadily upward in plain view, currently sitting at 12 minutes and 40 seconds. Tristan's face went chalk white, then it flushed violently with pure, unadulterated fury. You little... A businessman's instinct, I interrupted calmly, sliding the phone back into my breast pocket and buttoning my jacket. Or, well, a business Omega's, I suppose, in this particular body. Either way, Tristan, I have dealt with desperate, cornered men exactly like you before, in a life you will never, ever understand. Men who arrogantly mistake other people's quiet kindness for stupidity. Across the room, Silas was already rising rapidly from his corner table, his massive frame casting a terrifying shadow, his expression absolutely thunderous as he realized the confrontation was escalating. But I lifted a single hand slightly, offering a silent, precise signal for him to wait. Because I wasn't finished holding the executioner's axe just yet. Here is exactly what is going to happen now, I said, my voice low, vicious, and perfectly even. You are going to leave Silas, those 3 children, and myself alone. Permanently, you will never speak our names again. Or this incredibly clear audio recording finds its way to the desk of every single financial backer and business partner your rotting logistics company has left, along with a very detailed explanation of exactly what kind of pathetic, Extortionist criminal you have become in your desperation to stave off bankruptcy. Tristan stared at me, his mouth opening and closing, his golden charm completely obliterated by the sheer, terrifying reality of his total defeat. I stood up, casually smoothing the lapels of my black jacket, and met his furious, terrified eyes without a millimeter of flinching. I built an empire out of absolute nothing once before, I said softly, leaning over the table so only he could hear me. I know exactly how vicious people like you will get when they are backed into a corner, but I also know exactly how to corner them first. Checkmate, Tristan. Have a terrible evening. I turned on my heel and walked away without waiting for his pathetic response. Silas fell into step perfectly beside me the exact moment I passed his shadowy table. His large hand instantly found the small of my back. I could feel the mixture of lingering alpha fury and something that looked disturbingly, wonderfully like absolute awe radiating off him. "Remind me," Silas murmured, his breath ghosting over my ear as we pushed through the heavy glass doors of the restaurant and out into the freezing night air. "Remind me to never, ever underestimate you in a boardroom, Julian." "You better get used to it, darling." I laughed breathlessly, the adrenaline finally crashing through my system. And then, right there on the illuminated city street, completely uncaring of who might be watching or taking photographs from the shadows, I let Silas pull me flush against his chest and kiss me. It was slow, deep, and impossibly certain, the taste of total, absolute victory, and something far more dangerous, something that felt suspiciously like free-falling in love, tangled together between us in the cold air. Over Silas's shoulder, through the frosted glass window of the restaurant, I caught one final glimpse of Tristan Vance sitting completely alone at our abandoned table. His golden charm was completely stripped away, leaving only the hollow, devastated look of a man who had just realized, far too late, that he had started a war with the wrong Omega. "Round one to me," I thought fiercely, tucking my freezing hands into the pockets of Silas's warm overcoat as he wrapped his arm securely around my shoulders, leading me toward the waiting town car. Tristan Vance, of course, did not go quietly into the night. Cornered animals rarely do. 3 days after the restaurant ambush, Silas received an emergency call from his lead corporate attorney. A massive shipping contract dispute had been filed in federal court with theatrical, aggressive speed. Tristan's failing company was alleging a breach of terms on a minor, convoluted logistics agreement so incredibly old, I severely doubted anyone, but Tristan himself even remembered it existed. "It's completely baseless," Silas growled later that evening, pacing the length of his study like a caged lion, his jaw tight with barely contained fury. He threw a stack of legal documents onto the desk. "It isn't meant to win in court, it's meant to be loud. It's meant to drag the Thorne name through another vicious news cycle, tank our quarterly stock prices, and remind us both that he hasn't surrendered." "Then let him," I said calmly from the leather armchair by the fire, sipping a cup of decaf tea. Silas stopped pacing and stared at me. "Let him sue us. Every single hour his expensive lawyers spend manufacturing a fake lawsuit is an hour he is not spending finding a real weapon to hurt this family," I reasoned, setting my teacup down. "And every single scandalous headline he generates right now just gives us the perfect, justified excuse to accidentally leak the restaurant recording ourselves. We frame the narrative exactly how we choose. We let him dig his own grave, Silas, and then we gladly hand him the shovel." Silas studied me across the expanse of the dimly lit study for a long, quiet moment. An expression somewhere between utter exasperation and profound open admiration warred visibly on his handsome face. "You think 3 steps ahead of every single person in every room you walk into, don't you?" Silas asked softly. "Old habits from a past life," I smiled, looking down at my hands. "Hard to unlearn." Silas crossed the room slowly. He knelt on the rug beside my chair and gently cupped my face in both of his massive, warm hands. The sheer, terrifying gentleness of the gesture even now, weeks into this strange new reality, completely undid something soft and closely guarded inside my chest. "I used to think that was Julian's greatest, most dangerous flaw," Silas murmured, his thumb slowly tracing the sharp line of my cheekbone. "The ruthless calculation, the emotional distance, the plotting." He held my gaze, his gray eyes darkening with emotion. "I think now," Silas whispered, "it might be the thing I love the most about you." The heavy monumental word landed squarely between us in the quiet room, and neither of us moved a single inch to take it back. Say that again, I breathed, my breath catching painfully in my throat, my heart hammering against my ribs. I love you, Silas said. His voice was completely steady this time, deliberate, intentional. His gray eyes were locked onto mine, without a single trace of the bitter ice that had once lived there. I don't know exactly when it happened. I only know that I stopped being terrified of it. Somewhere around the fourth time I watched you sit on the nursery floor and patiently let my traumatized children learn to trust you, instead of walking away from them when it got hard. I grabbed the lapels of his shirt and dragged him forward, kissing him desperately before my cynical brain could talk myself into a more measured, careful response. He kissed me back with equal desperation, like a man who had spent 18 agonizing months thoroughly believing he had used up his one and only chance at happiness, only to miraculously discover that the universe wasn't finished writing his story yet. The frivolous lawsuit collapsed violently within the month, exactly as I had predicted. Silas's elite legal team meticulously dismantled Tristan's claims in a single, brutal federal filing. The accompanying press coverage, which I had carefully, quietly seeded with anonymous leaks detailing the exact truth about Tristan's actual extortion motives and his company's catastrophic debt, quietly finished what the audio recording threat had started. Tristan's family's remaining corporate backers and logistics partners began, one by one, to publicly distance themselves, pulling their funding overnight. By the time the first heavy snow of winter finally set in over the estate, Tristan Vance had been reduced to a cautionary tale whispered about at high society cocktail parties, rather than a threat whispered about us. He never contacted either of us, or the children, ever again. Meanwhile, the twins growing inside me made their existence known in ways that could no longer be hidden under tailored suits or strategized around. I stood in the sterile, brightly lit private doctor's office in my 5th month of pregnancy. Silas's large hand was wrapped so tightly around mine I thought he might crack my bones. Together, we stared at the glowing ultrasound monitor, watching 2 tiny, rapidly flickering heartbeats move across the screen. I felt something inside me, some old, heavily guarded, hyper-independent part of my soul that had learned in my first life to never fully trust good things to stay. Finally, completely let go. 2, Silas choked out, his voice incredibly thick with emotion. He was staring at the black and white screen like he was desperately trying to memorize the pixelated shapes. 2 more. 2 more, I agreed softly, leaning my head against his shoulder. I realized I was crying, the tears coming easily now, the way I had slowly learned to let this body and this incredible life simply feel things without fear. We told the children the news together that evening. All 3 of them were piled onto the massive bed in our master suite, completely ignoring the informal household rules about dirty shoes on the silk duvet. I watched, my heart lodged firmly in my throat, as the absolute magnitude of the news landed on their small faces. Babies? Chloe repeated, her brown eyes enormous, clutching a pillow to her chest. Like ours? Yours, I confirmed, reaching out to tap her small nose. Your little brother and sister, we'll know for sure soon. Leo sat up straight, his face incredibly serious, as he slowly did the math in his head. He brought the same intense, tactical seriousness to this that he brought to everything. So, there's going to be 5 of us kids now? 5 of you, Silas confirmed, his arm wrapped securely around my waist. He looked at Leo, his voice turning fierce and absolute. And I intend to love every single one of you exactly as much as the others. No exceptions, no favorites, ever. Leo's dark eyes flicked over to me. There was a quiet, lingering question in his gaze. Even now, months into this fragile, rebuilt trust we shared, he was waiting for the catch. That includes me feeling that way too, Leo, I said gently, making sure he heard the unwavering truth in my voice. You 3 aren't going to be pushed aside or forgotten for the twins, ever. I promise you that. And you know by now that I never, ever break my promises to you. Something in Leo's rigid shoulders finally, fully released. It was a deep physical tension I suddenly realized he had been quietly, exhaustingly carrying since the very first day I had knocked on that silent nursery door. He had been holding his breath, waiting for the wicked step-parent's story to reassert itself, waiting for the other shoe he had been trained to expect to finally drop. It never came, and it never would. That was the whole point of my transmigration. Finn, small, solemn, and incredibly quiet, scooted across the mattress and tucked his small body firmly against my side. He looked up at me with his father's gray eyes. "Julian," he whispered, "can I feel them?" I smiled, my chest aching with love, and gently guided his small, warm hand to rest against the heavy curve of my stomach beneath my sweater. After a few seconds, one of the twins shifted aggressively beneath his palm. Finn gasped. His face completely broke open into the first full, toothy, entirely unguarded smile I had ever seen from him since the day I woke up in this universe. "Hi, babies," Finn whispered to my stomach, his eyes shining with awe. "I'm your big brother." The twins arrived on a remarkably bright, crisp morning in early spring. It was a boy and a girl. They were loud, furious at being born, and absolutely, heartbreakingly perfect. Silas held them both against his chest with the careful, disbelieving, terrified wonder of a man who had once been absolutely certain he would never let himself want anything this fully again. Later that afternoon, Liu, Finn, and Chloe crowded excitedly around the hospital bed. I watched them, utterly exhausted, my entire body aching, but happier and more fulfilled than I had ever once believed this stolen, chaotic life could make me. I watched as 5 children who shared absolutely nothing but a father, a massive house, and now a fierce, unshakable, hard-won loyalty became unmistakably, undeniably a family. "What are we going to name them?" Chloe demanded, standing on her tiptoes and already claiming the tiny girl's wrinkled hand with one of her fingers. "I get to help." Silas looked over the top of their heads at me. His expression was soft, open, and so thoroughly unguarded that it made my heart stutter. He was the face of a man who bore absolutely no resemblance at all to the ruthless, frozen, terrifying enigma I had first sat across from at a silent dinner table, months and an entire lifetime ago. "Julian gets to choose," Silas said softly, his eyes never leaving mine. "He's the one who fought the hardest to get us here." I looked down at the 2 incredibly small, red faces blinking blindly up at me. I looked at Leo's hand resting fiercely and protectively on his new baby sister's pink blanket. I looked at Finn leaning comfortably into his father's side, absolutely safe. I looked at Chloe, who was already whispering an elaborate, magical story to the twins about what kind of incredible people they were going to grow up to be. I thought about the dark, poisonous story I had almost inherited. I thought about the wicked Omega, the broken, poisoned Alpha, the 3 traumatized children driven out of their own home into the cold. I thought about twins born into a legacy of cruelty and greed, instead of being born into this circle of warmth. I thought about exactly how close this entire family had come to becoming an absolute tragedy, instead of whatever this incredibly beautiful thing was now. It was messy, it was hard-won, but it was entirely, wonderfully real. "Hope," I said finally, gently touching the little girl's tiny, flailing fist, and for the boy I looked down at his tiny face, already seeing the exact shape of Silas's stubborn jaw visible in miniature. "Rowan," I said, smiling through fresh tears, "because we are absolutely not repeating anyone else's tragic story from here on out, we are going to write our own." Silas smiled. He leaned down over the bed, pressing a soft kiss to my forehead. Then he kissed my mouth, unhurried, certain, and tasting like home in a way neither of us had ever expected to find in a marriage that had started as someone else's nightmare. "Our own story," Silas agreed quietly against my lips. "I really like the sound of that." Outside the hospital window, the bright spring light spilled like liquid gold across the room. It illuminated 5 incredible children who had learned, slowly, painfully, and against every terrible expectation they had been given, that broken families could be beautifully rebuilt instead of merely survived. And I closed my eyes, held my husband's hand, and let myself finally, completely believe that I had won the war.